Hi, I'm Mark from eReplacementParts.com. Welcome to part 2 of our video series on the removal, disassembly, and reassembly of a Troy-Bilt small frame tiller transmission. In part 1, we removed the transmission from the tiller. In part 2, we're going to cover the disassembly of the transmission. We will also point out some of the common failures that can occur within the transmission. Let's get started. Our tiller consists of the cast transmission housing, the tying shaft and the tying gear inside, the wheel shaft as well as the wheel gear, the main drive shaft, bearings and bearing seals, and the oil covers. To get started, we need to remove the oil from the transmission. So I'm going to pull one of the covers and drain the oil. Okay, I've drained the majority of the oil from the transmission. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the other cover. Now that I have the other cover removed, I'm going to go ahead and drain out the last little bit of oil that's still in the transmission. Troy-Bilt's first run of these tillers used a silicone-type sealant to seal the covers. Starting in 2009, they changed over to a paper gasket. If your tiller is one of the older ones with the silicone sealant, you'll want to use a scraper to remove the sealant from both the transmission housing and from the cover. Next, I'll remove this end cover. This end cover contains the main drive shaft. They do use some silicone sealant on this cover. The easiest way to remove it is to take a mallet, or you might need to use a punch, and spin the cover around until you have the edges of the cover separated from the rest of the transmission housing. Then you can use a punch, or in this case I'm just going to use a screwdriver, and tap that cover away from the transmission housing. Once removed, again you'll want to remove that sealant from around both the cover and the face of the transmission. There are some bearing shims behind the cover. Now I'm going to use a pick and pull those away. There are 2 shims on my tiller, but that'll vary. You may have more or less. Now I can go ahead and slide the main drive shaft out of the transmission body. To get it started, you may need to use a rubber mallet to strike the end of the shaft. Only use a rubber mallet here. You don't want to use a regular hammer, or you'll mushroom the end of the shaft and make it so that you won't be able to use these threads anymore. Once I have it started, I can just pull it out by hand. There's a couple roller bearings on each end of the shaft, and you just want to keep track of those as you slide the shaft out of the transmission housing so they don't come apart on you. Now I need to remove the main drive shaft sill from the drive axle end of the tiller. To do that, I'm going to use a screwdriver from the inside and just tap it out. Behind the sill, there's a retaining ring for the bearing race, and I'll go ahead and pull that out. And now I can remove the bearing race. Now we'll take a couple of minutes and look at the areas of the transmission where wear or failures are most likely to occur. We'll start by looking at the main drive shaft. At either end of the main drive shaft, you have a roller bearing. Of course, over time, any bearing can fail. If the bearings don't roll freely, if there's any grinding or any side-to-side movement within the bearing, you'll want to go ahead and replace these while you have the transmission torn down. Also on the main drive shaft, you have a gear on either end. The smaller toothed gear runs the wheels on your tiller, where the larger gear runs the tines. Most likely, if there's an issue with these gears, it's going to be on the tine gear, as there's more torque involved in this gear. But you want to check for wear on the wheel gear as well. Both the tine shaft and the wheel shaft are driven by a couple of brass gears. These brass gears are probably more likely to fail than the steel gear on the main drive shaft. So you'll want to inspect those gears for excessive wear or for an actual tooth to be broken off. And of course, if it is broken, you'll want to go ahead and replace it. It's important if you have excessive wear on the gears or if you have teeth missing to make sure that you get all of the oil out of the transmission and clean everything really, really well before you put it back together. Otherwise, that metal that's inside of the transmission can just go ahead and ruin your new gears. Both the wheel shaft and the tine shaft have a bearing seal on either side and a bearing on either side. Again, over time, any bearing can go bad. So again, this is a spot you'll want to inspect for wear. If the bearings don't spin freely, or again, if there's any play in the bearing, you'll want to replace it. If you're getting excessive oil leaking out from these shafts, you'll want to go ahead and replace the bearing seals. As you'll see as we continue on with the teardown, we have to destroy these seals to remove them. So I think it's a good idea if you're going to tear your transmission completely down for repair to just go ahead and replace your seals regardless. It just doesn't make sense to do that much work and then find out later that you have a bad seal. Now we can move on to removing the wheel shaft and the tine shaft. And the first thing we need to do is remove the oil seal on each side. Like I mentioned before, we will end up destroying the seal, removing it. The first thing we need to do here is get something that we can grab onto with a pair of pliers. And to do that, I'm going to take a drill and just drill through the metal face of the seal. Next, I'm going to take a small screwdriver and just bend at the metal and even tear it until I have a little tag of metal that I can grab onto with the pliers. Now that I have that metal tag started, I can use some pliers to pull the seal. With the bearing seals out of the way, now I have access to another bearing retaining ring. And I'll go ahead and pull that out. Now I can go ahead and remove the shaft. Tillers produced prior to 2009 had a spacer and a washer inside between the side of the transmission housing and the gear. On those models, you'll have to use, again, a rubber mallet and beat the shaft out of the transmission housing. This is because the Woodruff key will actually poke its way right through that washer, and the washer will have to be replaced. In a tiller produced after 2009 like this one, you'll be able to just simply slide the shaft right out of the tiller. With the shaft removed, now I can go ahead and pull the gear out from the gearbox. I also can slide the other bearing out from the transmission housing and again out through the top. And now I just repeat the same process with the tine shaft on the other side. At this point, the only parts left on our transmission housing are the other two oil seals and the bearing retaining rings on the inside. I'm not going to remove these for our demonstration, but if you wanted to remove them, you could just stick a punch through the opposite side of the transmission housing up against the seal and punch the seal out, and then go ahead and remove your bearing retainers. Now that we have the transmission disassembled, we can move on to reassembly, and that will be the topic of part 3 in this video series. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave us a comment or ask a question.